Welcome back, gang. In this tutorial, I'll consider a common strategy for managing long sentences, the resumptive modifier. To illustrate the strategy, I'll examine two sentences written by the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins in his book The Blind Watchmaker. First, let's define the strategy. A resumptive modifier is an appositive phrase that repeats a word in order to transform it into a topic. Let's look at an example. As I read it aloud, listen for the repetition and notice where I pause. The whole skull of a bony flatfish retains the twisted and distorted evidence of its origins. Its very imperfection is powerful testimony of its ancient history, a history of step-by-step change rather than of deliberate design. It's the second sentence that contains the resumptive modifier. The word history is followed by a comma, which explains why I paused right there, and then the word history is repeated. The two words are in apposition. By that, I mean that they are two noun phrases positioned next to each other that refer to the same idea. You can imagine that the sentence could have ended after the first reference to history, but it doesn't. We have a short pause, and then the sentence resumes its discussion of the history, adding new details about it. So what's the benefit? It's helpful to think of the sentence in two chunks. The topic of the first chunk is imperfection. The topic of the second chunk is the history. The fact that the word history begins the second chunk makes it the topic. Let's remove the resumptive modifier and imagine how the sentence might have sounded without it. The whole skull of a bony flatfish retains the twisted and distorted evidence of its origins. Its very imperfection is powerful testimony of its ancient history of step-by-step change rather than of deliberate design. Two things should have really stood out. The first is how I was almost out of breath by the time I finished reading the sentence. Without the comma, there's no place to pause. And that's the case whether you're listening to the sentence or reading it silently. Length matters. The longer a sentence goes without an interruption, the more a reader will struggle to follow it. The second thing to notice is how the word history gets lost in the middle of things. Without the repetition, it never has the chance to become a new topic, so the reader never has a chance to focus on it. Let's go back to the original. It should be easier to see now how the resumptive modifier lets the reader pause for a moment to absorb the first idea before moving on to the second. As a result, both ideas are easy to follow, and the word history gets a lot of emphasis. The Blind Watchmaker is a book about evolution. The paragraphs about the flatfish discuss its evolutionary history. Emphasizing the word history improves the coherence of those paragraphs. Let's examine a similar sentence. This time, let's begin by considering how it might have been written without a resumptive modifier. Evolutionists of all stripes believe that the Cambrian explosion represents a very large gap in the fossil record that is simply due to the fact that very few fossils have lasted from periods before about 600 million years ago. This sentence is 39 words long. Even for academic writing, that's way above average, and it's about twice the length of an average sentence in this book. So if I were the author, I would be concerned about the length. I would also be concerned that there are no commas to help the reader break the sentence into chunks. To improve the sentence, I'll look for a spot roughly in the middle where I can insert a break. And there is a good spot. Do you see it? Everything from that to the end is an adjective clause. And it turns out that the space before an adjective clause is an ideal place to insert a resumptive modifier. I'll give myself some room to work. Now I need a word that I can repeat. To find it, I'll work my way backward to the thing that the relative pronoun refers to. At first, you might think it's the fossil record, but that doesn't fit the meaning of the rest of the sentence. The next possibility is gap, and that does fit the meaning. So let's begin our resumptive modifier with a comma and the word gap. Now we can close the space and read the sentence as Dawkins did in fact write it. Listen for the repetition and notice where I pause. Evolutionists of all stripes believe that the Cambrian explosion represents a very large gap in the fossil record, a gap that is simply due to the fact that very few fossils have lasted from periods before about 600 million years ago. It's amazing that such a simple change can make such a big difference. As before, the comma signals a natural break where readers can pause and collect their thoughts before moving on. A happy consequence of the pause and the repetition is that the word gap is strongly emphasized now. In the imaginary text, that word was lost. It wasn't a topic and it wasn't the end of a clause. In Dawkins' version, it's both of those things. I call that a happy consequence because gaps in the fossil record are the focus of the chapter in which the sentence appears. In all, the word gap is repeated 18 times within a space of 29 pages. And as we know, consistent topic strings add coherence to our writing. In short, the resumptive modifier is a tool that you can use to solve certain kinds of problems. It can add a pause to a long sentence, making the sentence easier to read, and it can improve coherence by transforming a lost word into a topic. Let me add a word of caution. A resumptive modifier is pretty conspicuous. Readers will notice it. So you don't want to use the strategy more than once or twice in a single essay. Use it only when it's the best tool for the job. Thanks for watching. Say what you mean.